The chamber doors sealed behind me with a sound like a held breath finally let go, and every eye in that circular hall turned to look at me at once. I did not sit. I stood in the center of the marble floor, under the cold blue light of the Coalition emblem, and I felt the weight of 40 different species staring at me like I had already said something wrong. I had not said anything yet. The Speaker of the Council, a tall being with silver skin and eyes like still water, tapped her staff against the floor 3 times. The sound echoed off the high walls. "Commander Vexthera Ilnor," she said, "you have been summoned to give testimony on the Terran species. The vote for their induction into the Coalition Military Alliance takes place in 1 hour. Your word carries more weight than any report on this table. Speak plainly." 1 hour. That was all the time I had to change the minds of people who had already decided. I looked around the room. I saw delegates from 6 star systems, warriors who had fought in wars longer than most species had existed, diplomats who had never once held a weapon in their lives, and every single one of them wore the same expression: doubt, suspicion, a kind of quiet fear dressed up as caution. "You want to know if humans deserve a place beside us," I said. My voice did not shake, though something inside my chest did. "You have read the reports. You have seen the numbers. Casualties they accepted that no sane commander should accept. Missions they refused to abandon when every calculation said to pull back. You call it recklessness. You call it a threat to good military order." A delegate from the outer ring, a broad-shouldered being with plated skin, rose halfway from his seat. "Because it is a threat, Commander. An army that does not calculate its losses is an army that will destroy itself and everyone standing near it. We have seen this before. Species that burn bright and die young." "Then let me tell you what I saw," I said, "before you decide what kind of fire this is." The room went quiet. Even the delegate who had spoken sat back down, arms folded, waiting for me to prove myself wrong. I did not want to go back to Ren Sha. Not in my mind, not in my voice, not in front of strangers who had never smelled smoke or heard the sound a shield makes when it finally fails. But I owed it to the people who were not standing here to speak for themselves. I owed it to the ones who never came home. 3 years ago, I commanded a defense line on Outpost Ren Sha, I said. A quiet mining colony, 12,000 civilians. Half our forces were pulled to defend the capital worlds, which left us thin, exposed and forgotten. When the Kestenar fleet came through the outer belt, we had less than a day to prepare. I paused, and I let myself remember the sound of the alarms, not to relive it for them, but because I needed to say it right. We had 1 human unit stationed with us, newly assigned. Nobody expected much from them. They were the youngest species most of us had ever fought beside, barely out of their own solar system, still arguing among themselves back home about things that seemed small compared to a galaxy at war. Command sent them to us almost as an afterthought, a gesture. Nobody thought they would matter. I looked directly at the delegate who had challenged me. I thought the same thing. I was wrong. Somewhere in the back of the chamber, a young age shifted her weight, listening closer now. I could feel the room leaning toward me, even the ones who did not want to. When the attack came, it came fast, faster than our models predicted. The Kestenar do not fight to win ground, they fight to erase it. Within the first hour, our outer defense line broke. I gave the order to fall back to the inner ring and prepare for evacuation. It was the correct order. It was the order any of you would have given. But not the humans. I said it simply, without dressing it up, because the truth did not need decoration. They held their position, not out of arrogance, not because they misunderstood the danger. I spoke to their commanding officer myself over the comm, screaming at him to pull his people back before they were cut off. He said something to me that I have not been able to forget since. He said, "There are still people in that lower district who have not made it to the shuttles." I told him the district was already lost. He said, "Not everyone in it is." I let that sit in the air for a moment. They stayed, 11 of them, against a wall of enemy fire that our own trained instincts told us was unsurvivable. I watched the feed from the outpost cameras. I watched them go door to door through a collapsing district, pulling out families who had frozen in fear, elderly miners who could not run, children who did not understand what was happening, not because a mission required it, not because their command demanded it, because someone was still there. A voice from the council floor, quieter this time, almost hesitant. And how many of them survived? I met the speaker's eyes before I answered. 4. The word landed heavy in the chamber. Nobody spoke. 7 of them did not make it out of that district. They knew, before they went in, that some of them would not come back. I have reviewed the tactical logs 100 times since that day, and I promise you, every single one of them understood the odds better than most soldiers I have commanded in 20 years of service. They were not blind to the danger. They walked into it with their eyes open. I turned slowly, taking in every face in that circular room, giving each of them a moment to hold my gaze or look away. You call that recklessness. I have spent 3 years trying to find a better word for it, and I have not found one that fits cleanly. It was not recklessness. It was not blind courage. It was a choice, made again and again, by people who understood exactly what it would cost them and decided the cost was worth paying. The delegate with the plated skin leaned forward again, but his voice had lost some of its edge. One battle does not define a species, Commander. You know this better than anyone. You're right, I said. It doesn't. So let me tell you what happened after. I could see it now, the shift in the room. The doubt had not disappeared, but it had cracked open just enough to let something else through. Curiosity, maybe even the beginning of respect. After the district was cleared, I went down to the surface myself. I wanted to see what was left. I wanted to understand what I had just witnessed, because nothing in my training had prepared me for it. I found the surviving humans in a makeshift medical shelter, treating their own wounded alongside ours, sharing supplies that were already running short, working through exhaustion that would have broken most soldiers I know. One of them was cleaning a wound on the arm of a Ferali engineer who had lost half her unit in the same district. This engineer was not even part of their command structure. She was a stranger to them, and still this human soldier sat beside her for an hour, talking quietly, keeping her calm, staying long after the medical work was finished because he did not want her to be alone. I paused, and for the first time since I had entered the chamber, I let my voice soften. I asked him why he stayed with someone who was not his responsibility. He looked at me like it was the strangest question he had ever heard. He said, "She's not my responsibility. She's a person. That's enough." The chamber was silent in a different way now. Not the silence of judgment, something closer to weight settling. "I have fought beside a dozen species in my career," I said. "I have seen bravery in many forms. I have seen soldiers who fight because they are ordered to, soldiers who fight because they fear the consequences of retreat, soldiers who fight for glory that will follow them home. What I saw on Ren Sha was different. It was not fear of punishment. It was not the pursuit of honor. It was something simpler and, I have come to believe, something far more dangerous to understand from the outside looking in." I let the silence stretch for a moment before I finished. They did not calculate whether a life was worth the risk before deciding to save it. They simply decided the life mattered, and then they acted. That is not the behavior of a reckless species. That is the behavior of a species that has decided, somewhere deep in its history, that some things are worth more than survival itself. The Speaker of the Council studied me for a long moment, her still water eyes giving nothing away. "That is a powerful account, Commander. But the Council will want more than a single battle before making a decision that affects every system under our protection." "I know," I said. "That is why I am not finished." I looked around the room one more time, at the faces still uncertain, still weighing what they had heard against everything they believed they knew. "You asked me to speak plainly, so I will. What you call recklessness, I have come to understand as something closer to conviction, and before this hour is over, I intend to show you exactly how far that conviction goes, because the story I just told you was only the beginning of what I learned that day, and it is not even the hardest truth I have to share with this room. I straightened my shoulders and prepared myself for what came next, because the easiest part of my testimony was already behind me, and the council still had no idea how much more there was to hear. No one in that chamber moved. The speaker raised a hand, and a serving attendant brought forward a glass of water for me, but I did not touch it. I was not thirsty. I was trying to find the right place to begin the next part of what I needed to say, because what happened after Ren Sha changed the way I looked at every battle that came after it. After the district was cleared, I said, the fighting did not stop, it only moved. The Kestnar fleet regrouped in the upper atmosphere and prepared a second wave, larger than the first. By that point, our forces were stretched thin across 3 defense points, and I made the decision to consolidate everyone at the central command post, including the surviving humans. I expected them to need rest. They had already lost 7 of their own. I expected grief, exhaustion, perhaps even reluctance to go back into danger so soon. What I found instead surprised me more than anything I witnessed in the lower district. I could feel the room settling in, waiting. Their commanding officer, a young man named Daniel Hart, approached me before I had even finished issuing new orders. He did not ask for time to grieve. He did not ask to be reassigned somewhere safer. He asked where he was needed most. A murmur passed through a few of the delegates, quiet but unmistakable. I remember looking at him and asking if he understood what he was asking. His unit had been cut in half in a single afternoon. I told him plainly that no one in that room would think less of him if he requested medical leave for his remaining soldiers. He looked at me, and I will never forget what he said. He said, "The people we lost went in because someone needed help. If I pull my remaining people back now, it feels like I'm saying their sacrifice only mattered until it got hard. I can't do that to them." I paused there, letting the weight of it settle before continuing. I did not fully understand what he meant at the time. I understand it now. For humans, it seemed, the loss of someone they cared about was not a reason to retreat from danger. It was a reason to make sure the danger did not claim anyone else, if they could help it. Grief, for them, did not weaken their resolve. It sharpened it. The delegate with the plaited skin, the one who had challenged me earlier, spoke again, though his voice had lost its earlier certainty. "That is an unusual way to process loss, Commander. Many species would call that denial, a refusal to properly grieve before returning to danger." "I considered that possibility myself," I said, so I watched him closely over the following hours. I did not see denial. I saw something closer to focus. He grieved. I watched him grieve, quietly, in the moments between orders, when he thought no one was looking, but he did not let it stop him from doing what needed to be done. He held both things at once, the sorrow and the duty, without letting either one cancel out the other. I turned to address the whole chamber now, not just the one delegate who kept testing my account. When the second wave arrived, our defenses were still not fully repaired. The central shield generator had taken damage in the earlier fighting, and our engineers estimated we needed at least 20 more minutes before it would hold against a full assault. 20 minutes we did not have. The Kestnar ships were already entering low orbit. I gave the order to prepare for a fighting retreat. It was the responsible choice. It would have saved most of our remaining forces, though it would have meant abandoning the shield generator and likely losing the colony's primary water processing facility, which supported every remaining civilian still sheltering underground. I let that detail sit, because it mattered. Daniel Hart requested permission to hold the generator site with what remained of his unit, buying the engineers the time they needed. 4 soldiers, against a wave that our own tactical models gave almost no chance of surviving. I want to be honest with this council. I almost refused him. I had already lost enough people that day. I did not want to sign off on what looked, on paper, like a sentence. But he said something to me that I have thought about every day since. He said, "Commander, if we retreat now, that generator falls, and everyone underground loses their water supply within a week. We're not choosing between saving 4 soldiers and losing 4 soldiers. We're choosing between 4 and thousands. I know which side of that math I can live with." The chamber was utterly still. I gave him permission. I did not think I would see him again. I looked down at my own hands for a moment, before continuing, because even now, the memory carried weight I had not fully set down. They held that position for 19 minutes. I watched the feed from the command post the entire time, unable to look away, unable to do anything but listen to the comm chatter and hope. They did not have advanced weapons. They did not have overwhelming numbers. What they had was a refusal to move from a line they had decided needed to be held, no matter what came at them. When the shield came back online, 3 of the 4 were still standing. Daniel Hart was one of them. I do not know how. I have reviewed the footage more times than I can count, and I still do not fully understand how 4 soldiers held that line as long as they did. Every calculation I have ever trusted told me it should not have been possible. I let my gaze move across the room, resting briefly on each face. I do not tell you this story to suggest that humans are invincible or that their methods are without cost. They are not. They lost people that day. They lost people who mattered to them, people whose names I later learned, people whose families back on their homeworld will never see them again. I am not describing a fairy tale where courage always wins. I am describing something harder to explain and harder still to dismiss. The speaker leaned forward slightly on her staff. "What is it then, Commander? If not simple bravery, you have described something more specific than courage alone." "I have spent 3 years trying to name it properly," I admitted. "The closest I have come is this. Humans measure the worth of a fight differently than most of us do. We are trained, all of us, across every species in this coalition, to weigh the value of a mission against the acceptable cost in lives. It is how we build our strategies. It is how we justify our retreats. It is not wrong. It has kept our civilizations alive for centuries. But humans, at least the ones I fought beside, measure something else first. They ask who will be harmed if they do not act, before they ask what it will cost them to act. It changes the entire shape of the decision. It is not that they do not value their own lives. Daniel Hart valued his life. I could see it in the way he spoke about his family back home, a sister he mentioned more than once, a mother he was saving his pay to send back to. He was not indifferent to what he stood to lose. He simply believed that some things were worth risking it for. And when he decided something was worth that risk, no calculation I could offer him would change his mind. A delegate near the back of the chamber, one who had not spoken at all until now, a quiet being with soft, luminous markings along her arms, raised her hand slightly. "Commander, if I may ask, do you believe this makes them unstable as an ally? A species that acts on conviction rather than calculation could be unpredictable in a coordinated military structure." It was a fair question, and I took a moment before answering it. "I understand why that concern exists," I said. "I shared it myself, in the early hours of that battle. But I have had 3 years to observe what came after Ren Sha, and I can tell you this. Their conviction was never random. It was never chaotic. Every time I watched a human soldier make a decision that looked, from the outside, like recklessness, there was a clear reason behind it. A person who needed help, a structure that would fail if abandoned, a line that had to hold so something larger could survive. They are not soldiers without discipline. I want to be very clear about that, because I think it is the misunderstanding at the heart of this entire debate. Daniel Hart did not disobey orders that day. He asked for permission. He explained his reasoning clearly and quickly, under pressure that would have made most officers stumble over their own words. When I gave the order to hold, he executed it with more precision than I have seen from soldiers with a decade more experience. What makes them different is not a lack of discipline. It is what sits underneath that discipline, a willingness to accept enormous personal risk for the sake of people who are not required to matter to them at all. I paused, and I let my voice carry the next part with everything I had. I have fought in 17 major campaigns across my career. I have served beside soldiers from species who value honor above all else, species who value strategy above all else, species who value survival above all else. I had never, before Ren Sha, served beside a species that seemed to value other people above all else, even people who were strangers to them only hours before. That is what I saw that day. That is what changed the way I look at every battle I have fought since. And I promise you, Council, this is not the last account I intend to share with you today, because there is a part of this story that will be harder to hear than anything I have told you so far, and I believe you need to hear it before this vote takes place. No one reached for their water. No one whispered to the delegate beside them. They were waiting, all of them, for whatever came next, and I felt the shift in the air, the shift that told me I had stopped simply informing them and started to genuinely move something in them. I was not finished. Not by far. The Speaker of the Council raised her staff and struck it once against the floor, calling for a brief pause before I continued. I did not want the pause. I wanted to keep speaking while the room still held the shape of what I had just told them, before doubt found a way to creep back in. But protocol was protocol, and I stood there in silence while delegates whispered among themselves, some nodding slowly, others still frowning with the same skepticism they had walked in with. When the chamber settled again, the speaker looked at me and asked the question I had been waiting for. Commander, you have described actions that appear to defy fear itself. Many in this room believe that a species without fear cannot truly possess courage, since courage requires the presence of fear to overcome. Do you believe the Terrans feel fear as we do? It was the question at the very center of everything the Coalition misunderstood about humans, and I was glad she had asked it aloud instead of leaving it to sit unspoken in the room. I did not understand the answer myself until 3 days after the fighting ended, I said. Let me tell you how I learned it. I let my mind travel back to the quiet hours after the second wave had been pushed back, after the shield generator held, after the shuttles finally arrived to carry the wounded and the surviving civilians away from Ren Sha. The chaos of battle had a strange way of giving way to a different kind of chaos afterward, a slower, heavier kind, made of grief and exhaustion instead of noise and fire. There was a woman among the human unit, a field medic named Grace Miller. She had been with Daniel Hart's team from the beginning. She had treated wounded soldiers from 4 different species that day, working through injuries she had never studied in any medical text, improvising with equipment that was never designed for half the bodies she was treating. I found her sitting alone outside the medical shelter on the 3rd night, after most of the wounded had finally been stabilized. She was not tending to anyone in that moment. She was simply sitting, staring at nothing, her hands still faintly trembling. I paused, giving myself the space to say this next part carefully, because it mattered more than almost anything else I had to share. I sat down beside her, uncertain what to say. I told her what I had witnessed that day, how impressed I was by her unit's actions, how rare it was to see soldiers hold a line the way they had. I expected her to accept the praise with pride, or perhaps with the quiet confidence I had seen in Daniel Hart. Instead, she looked at me, and her eyes were full of something I did not expect. Fear. Raw, unguarded fear, the kind soldiers usually hide behind steady expressions and careful words. She said, I was terrified the entire time. I have been terrified since the first day I was assigned here. I'm terrified right now, sitting here, because I don't know if I did enough for the people who didn't make it. The chamber had gone completely silent. I could hear my own voice echoing faintly off the high walls. I asked her how she managed to function so effectively, if she carried that much fear with her into every moment of the fighting. I expected her to describe some kind of training, some discipline that allowed her to set fear aside the way soldiers of other species are taught to do. She told me something I have never forgotten. She said, "Nobody taught me how to not be afraid. I don't think that's something you can train out of a person. What they taught me was how to keep doing my job while I was afraid. Fear doesn't go away just because you decide to be brave. You just decide the job matters more than the fear does, and then you do the job anyway, every single time, even when it doesn't get any easier." I let the silence stretch, because I wanted every delegate in that room to sit inside those words the way I had sat inside them 3 years ago. I have thought about that conversation more than any other moment from that campaign. For most species in this coalition, courage is something we associate with a kind of internal stillness, a mastery over the instinct to flee. We admire soldiers who appear unshaken, who move through danger as though it does not touch them. We have built entire training systems around teaching our warriors to suppress fear, to control it, to push it down until it no longer interferes with duty. Humans, it seems, do something entirely different. They do not suppress the fear. They do not deny it. They simply refuse to let it make their decisions for them. Grace Miller was afraid every single day she served on that colony, and she treated wounded soldiers from species she had never even heard of before that assignment, with hands that were shaking the entire time, because the fear never stopped her from believing the job still needed to be done. A delegate from one of the inner systems, an elder with deep engraved markings across her face, spoke quietly. "That is a heavier burden to carry than what we ask of our own soldiers, Commander. We train fear out of our warriors so that they do not have to fight it every day. You are describing a species that fights two battles at once, the enemy in front of them and the fear inside them." "That is exactly what I came to understand," I said, "and I want to be honest with this council about what that means, because I do not think it makes humans stronger than the rest of us in some simple, uncomplicated way. I think it makes them exhausted in ways most of us will never fully understand." I spoke with several of their soldiers over the following weeks, and every one of them described some version of what Grace Miller told me. None of them described themselves as fearless. All of them described carrying fear as a constant companion, something that never truly left, something they had simply learned to work alongside rather than wait to be free of. I could feel the shape of the room changing again, the earlier skepticism thinning into something quieter, something closer to genuine consideration. There was another soldier, a young man named Ethan Cole, barely out of his early service years, who told me something that I believe explains this better than anything else I could offer you today. I asked him directly if he was afraid during the battle for the generator site, the one where Daniel Hart and 3 others held the line for 19 minutes, against odds that should not have been survivable. He said, "I have never been more afraid of anything in my life. I thought about my parents. I thought about the fact that I might never see my hometown again. I thought about every single reason I had to run. And then I thought about the people underground who needed that water supply, people I had never met, people who would never know my name, and I stayed anyway. Being afraid didn't change what needed to happen. It just meant I had to be brave and afraid at the same time." I turned slowly, addressing the entire chamber now, letting my voice carry the full weight of what I had learned. "I believe this council has misunderstood the nature of human courage from the very beginning of our contact with this species. You have read the casualty reports and assumed carelessness. You have read the mission logs and assumed a disregard for their own survival. What I witnessed, and what I have confirmed through months of study and conversation since that campaign, is something far more deliberate than carelessness. Humans are not blind to danger. They do not walk into fire because they cannot feel its heat. They feel it more sharply in some ways than many of the species in this room, because their instincts for self-preservation are every bit as strong as ours. What sets them apart is a willingness to act against those instincts when they believe something else matters more. Not because the fear disappears, because they have decided, individually and collectively, that fear alone is not a good enough reason to fail someone who needs them." Unquote. The Speaker of the Council was quiet for a long moment, studying me with those still water eyes. "That is a difficult distinction for many species to understand, Commander. Fear and courage have always been framed as opposites in our own philosophies. You are suggesting they exist together, at the same time, in the same person." "I am not suggesting it," I said. "I watched it happen, over and over, for the better part of a week on Ren Sha, and I have watched it happen many times since, in every joint operation I have conducted alongside human forces. Grace Miller worked 18-hour shifts treating wounded soldiers, her hands shaking the entire time, without once refusing a patient. Ethan Cole held a line he believed he might not survive, carrying every fear a young soldier could carry, and did not step back from his position. Daniel Hart grieved 7 of his own soldiers and asked to be sent back into danger within hours, not because he was numb to the loss, but because the loss made him more determined to prevent the next one. I let my gaze settle on the delegate who had first challenged me, the one with the plated skin, who had called their behavior a threat to good military order. You called it recklessness earlier. I understand why. From the outside, without understanding what drives it, their actions can look indistinguishable from carelessness. But I have been on the inside of it now. I have sat beside them in the quiet hours after the fighting stopped, when there was no audience left to perform bravery for, when it would have been easy for them to admit they regretted what they had done. Not one of them ever did. They were afraid. They are always afraid, in one form or another, the way any thinking creature with something to lose is afraid. But they decided, long before I ever met them, that the fear did not get the final say in what kind of soldiers they would be. I do not know if that makes them the bravest species I have ever fought beside, or simply the most stubborn. Perhaps there is no meaningful difference between the two. I paused, letting my breath settle, feeling the shift in the room around me like a held tension finally beginning to loosen. But I know this much for certain. An army that fights without fear is an army that has stopped valuing what it stands to lose. An army that fights through fear, every day, without ever letting that fear win, is an army that understands exactly what it is risking and chooses to risk it anyway. I would rather stand beside soldiers who understand the cost of every battle than beside soldiers who have simply stopped feeling it. The chamber remained silent for a long moment, and I could see something shifting behind the eyes of even the most doubtful delegates. But I was not finished, and I knew the hardest part of my testimony was still ahead of me, because understanding what humans were was only half of what this council needed to hear. The other half was about what the coalition itself had become, and I was no longer certain they were ready for that truth. I stood there for a moment, feeling the shift in the room settle into something heavier, something closer to genuine unease. I had given them stories of courage, of fear carried and overcome, of soldiers who acted from something deeper than training, but the harder truth was still waiting behind my teeth, and I knew that once I said it, there would be no taking it back. There is one more part of this account I have not shared with you, I said. I have avoided it until now because I knew how it would be received, but you asked me to speak plainly, and I intend to honor that request completely, even if it costs me the comfort of this room. The speaker tilted her head slightly. Go on, Commander. When the second wave hit Ren Sha, before Daniel Hart and his soldiers held the generator line, I made a call to Coalition Central Command requesting reinforcement. I want this council to understand something clearly. Reinforcements were available. A battle group was stationed only 2 systems away, well within range to reach us, before the second wave made planetfall. I let that fact sit in the air, watching the reaction ripple across the room. My request was denied. A murmur passed through the chamber, quiet but sharp. I was told that Ren Sha was a low-priority colony, 12,000 civilians, a modest mining operation, no strategic military value beyond its resource output. Command determined that the projected cost of diverting a battle group outweighed the value of the colony itself. I was ordered to prepare for evacuation and accept the loss of the outpost if the defense could not hold. I looked directly at the delegate with the plated skin, the one who had spoken most forcefully about discipline and calculated risk. That decision was not made by a coward. It was not made by someone acting outside of coalition doctrine. It was made by an officer following exactly the kind of risk assessment this council has praised throughout this entire session. A calculated, disciplined, appropriately cautious decision, weighed carefully against acceptable losses. And it would have cost 12,000 lives if 4 human soldiers had not decided that math was not good enough for them. The chamber had gone utterly still. I could feel the discomfort radiating from several of the delegates, the kind of discomfort that comes not from disagreement, but from recognition. I do not say this to accuse anyone in this room personally. I say this because I believe this council has spent so many years building doctrines around acceptable loss, around calculated retreat, around protecting the greatest number through careful sacrifice of the few, that it has forgotten what it looks like when someone simply refuses to accept a loss at all. We have built an entire military philosophy around the idea that some things are simply not worth the risk. Ren Sha would have been erased under that philosophy, and no one following coalition doctrine that day would have been at fault. I let my voice grow quieter, not weaker, but more deliberate. Humanity has not yet learned to think that way. I do not know if that is because they are young as a species, still operating on instinct rather than doctrine, or if it is something more deliberate, something they have chosen to hold on to even as they build their own military structures. But I have served beside them for 3 years now, across a dozen operations since Ren Sha, and I have never once seen a human commander abandon a defensible position simply because the cost projection made retreat the wiser choice. They ask a different question first, not what is the acceptable loss. They ask what is actually at stake, and who will suffer if we choose the easier path. Sometimes the answer leads them to retreat, because they are not foolish, and they do understand that not every fight can be won. But I have never seen them retreat simply because the mathematics of a spreadsheet told them to. A new voice rose from the chamber floor, one I had not heard speak before, an older delegate near the front with weathered, sun-marked skin. "Commander, are you suggesting that coalition doctrine itself is flawed? That is a serious accusation to bring before this council." I met his gaze without flinching. I am suggesting exactly that, and I am prepared to stand behind it. I have spent my entire career trusting the doctrine this coalition was built upon. I trusted it the day I requested reinforcements for Ren Sha and was told the colony was not worth the cost. I trusted it because I had been trained since childhood to believe that careful calculation was the only path to keeping the greatest number of people alive. But I watched 4 soldiers, following a doctrine none of us had trained them in, save 12,000 lives that our own careful calculations had already written off. I have asked myself every day since then, how many colonies like Ren Sha exist across coalition space right now, quietly being deemed not worth the cost, waiting for a threat that our doctrine will tell us to abandon rather than defend. The room was silent in a way I had not heard it silent before, not since I entered the chamber. I am not asking this council to abandon caution entirely. Caution has kept our civilizations alive for centuries, and I do not dismiss its value lightly. But I am asking this council to consider what we have lost by making caution the highest value we hold. We have built a coalition so committed to avoiding unnecessary risk that we have started treating people as acceptable losses before the fighting has even begun. Humanity has not yet learned to do that, and I am no longer certain it is something they should ever learn. I paused, giving the weight of the words time to settle, before delivering the part I knew would be hardest for this room to hear. "You called their behavior a threat to good military order earlier in this session," I said, turning back to the delegate with the plaited skin. "I want to offer you a different way of understanding what nearly happened at Ren Sha. It was not humanity's instincts that nearly cost 12,000 civilians their lives that day. It was ours. It was a doctrine built by cautious, disciplined, experienced commanders, following every rule this coalition has ever written, that decided a colony full of people was not worth the resources required to save it. 4 young soldiers, barely trained in coalition tactics, decided otherwise, and they were right. I do not know how to reconcile that with everything I was taught to believe about sound military strategy. I only know what I witnessed, and I know that if this council inducts humanity into our alliance and then spends the next century trying to train that instinct out of them, in the name of discipline and calculated caution, we will have taken the very thing that makes them valuable and quietly destroyed it. The chamber remained still, but it was a different stillness now, heavier, more reflective. I could see delegates glancing at one another, no longer certain of the positions they had walked in with. "I am not asking you to make humanity more like us," I said, my voice steady even as the weight of the moment pressed against my chest. I am asking this council to consider whether we might need to become a little more like them. We have spent generations refining the art of deciding who is worth saving and who is not. Perhaps it is time we remembered what it looks like to simply decide that everyone is worth saving and figure out the cost afterward. The Speaker of the Council said nothing for a long moment, her still water eyes fixed on me with an intensity I had not seen from her before. When she finally spoke, her voice was quieter than it had been throughout the entire session. That is a heavy truth to bring before this chamber, Commander. Many in this room will not receive it easily. I did not expect them to, I said, but you asked me to speak plainly, and I intend to finish what I came here to say, because there is one more truth waiting behind everything I have told you today, and it is the one I have carried closest to my chest since the day Ren Sha was saved. I straightened, feeling the exhaustion of the telling settle into my shoulders, but I was not done. Not yet. The final truth was the hardest one to speak, because it was not about doctrine, or fear, or courage. It was about what I had lost, and what I still carried with me every single day since. My hand moved on its own, the way it always did when the weight of that memory rose too close to the surface. I reached beneath the collar of my uniform and drew out a small metal tag on a worn chain, warmed from resting against my skin. I held it up so the entire chamber could see it, a simple rectangle of stamped metal, foreign in shape to nearly every species in that room. "Do any of you know what this is?" I asked. No one answered. A few delegates leaned forward slightly, curious despite themselves. "It is called a dog tag," I said. "Every human soldier wears one. It carries their name, their identification number, and enough information to identify them if the worst happens and there is nothing left to identify but this small piece of metal. I have worn this one since the final day of the Ren Sha campaign, and I have not removed it since." I let my thumb pass over the raised letters, though I did not need to look at them to know what they said. I had traced them 1,000 times in the quiet hours between missions, in moments when sleep would not come, in moments when I needed to remember why I kept doing this work at all. "This belonged to Grace Miller," I said, "the medic I told you about, the one who sat beside me on the third night after the fighting and told me she had been afraid every day of her service, and did her work anyway." I paused, and for the first time since entering that chamber, I allowed my voice to carry the full weight of what I was about to say, without trying to smooth its edges or soften its impact. Grace Miller did not survive the campaign. The chamber was silent in the particular way silence falls when a room realizes it has been sitting inside someone else's grief without knowing it. She died 6 days after that conversation, during the final push to secure the colony's eastern supply routes. A Kestnar strike hit the medical shelter directly while she was treating 3 wounded soldiers, 2 of whom were not even human. She had the opportunity to evacuate before the strike came. Command had already ordered a full withdrawal from that position 20 minutes earlier. She stayed because the soldiers in her care could not be moved without risking their lives further, and she was not willing to leave them alone. I looked down at the tag in my hand, and for a moment I could not continue speaking. I let the silence hold, because some truths do not need to be rushed, and this was one of them. I was not there when it happened. I was coordinating the final evacuation of the civilian population 3 kilometers away. I did not learn what happened until the following morning, when Daniel Hart found me at the command post and handed me this tag. He told me she had asked him, only days before, to make sure someone kept it if anything happened to her, not because she wanted to be remembered as a hero. She told him, and he repeated this to me exactly as she said it, that she simply did not want to be forgotten as just another name on a casualty list. I closed my fingers around the tag, feeling the familiar shape of it press into my palm. I have worn it every day since, not as a trophy of what humanity accomplished on Ren Sha, not as a symbol to hold up in council chambers when I need to make a point. I wear it because Grace Miller was the first person, of any species, who ever made me understand what it truly means to value a life more than the fear of losing your own. I raised my eyes and looked slowly across the chamber, meeting the gaze of every delegate I could reach. I have spent this entire session telling you about strength, about courage, about a doctrine of caution that nearly cost 12,000 people their lives. But I have not yet told you the cost of what I am asking you to embrace. Humanity's willingness to give everything for people who are not required to matter to them is not free. It costs them everything, again and again, every time they make that choice. Grace Miller is not the only name I carry. She is simply the one closest to my heart. I drew a slow breath, steadying myself before continuing. There were 7 soldiers lost in the lower district on the first day of the battle. There was Grace Miller, lost on the 6th day, during the final evacuation. There were 4 more names added to that list before the campaign finally ended. Soldiers whose stories I have not shared with you today, because this session does not have enough hours remaining to hold the full weight of what happened on that colony. 12 names, 12 people who chose, over and over, to place someone else's survival above their own, until it finally cost them everything. I let that number settle into the room, heavy and undeniable. I do not tell you this to convince you that humanity is without flaw, or that their approach to conflict comes without terrible cost. It does. I have seen the cost with my own eyes. I have carried pieces of that cost with me for 3 years, in the form of a small metal tag that I have never once considered removing. What I am telling you is that they made that choice knowingly, every single time, understanding exactly what it might take from them, and they made it anyway, because the alternative, in their eyes, was worse. The Speaker of the Council spoke softly, her staff resting quietly against the floor now instead of striking it for order. What became of the colony, Commander, after the campaign ended? It survived, I said. Ren Sha still stands today. 12,000 civilians who would have been counted as an acceptable loss under coalition doctrine are alive because 4 soldiers refused to accept that math. Their children are alive, their families are alive. An entire mining operation that continues to supply resources across 3 neighboring systems still exists because a handful of young humans decided a colony that Coalition Command had already written off was worth saving. I let my gaze travel across the room one final time, taking in every face, every expression, from the ones who had softened toward genuine understanding to the ones who still held tightly to their doubts. I did not come before this council today to tell you that humanity is a species without flaws, or that their instincts are always correct, or that the cost of their conviction is small enough to overlook. I came here to tell you the truth, exactly as I witnessed it, because you asked me to speak plainly, and because I believe the people who gave everything on Ren Sha deserve to have their story told honestly, without exaggeration and without diminishment. I straightened, gathering the last of what I needed to say, feeling the full weight of the testimony I had carried into that chamber finally reaching its end. You are being asked today to decide whether humanity deserves a place within this coalition, as full military allies, standing beside every species in this room. I cannot make that decision for you, but I can tell you what I have learned in 3 years of serving alongside them, watching them grieve, watching them fear, watching them choose again and again to run toward danger instead of away from it, not because they do not understand what they stand to lose, but because they have decided some things are worth losing everything for. I believe this galaxy is entering a period where that kind of conviction will matter more than it ever has before. The threats gathering at our borders will not wait for us to perfect our doctrines of acceptable loss. They will not pause while we calculate whether a colony is worth the cost of defending it. I believe we need soldiers who ask a different question first, the question humanity seems to ask before any other, not what will this cost us, who will be lost if we do nothing. I lowered the tag gently back beneath my collar, letting it rest against my chest where it had rested for 3 years, close enough that I could feel its shape even now. I am not asking you to abandon caution. I am not asking you to throw away everything this coalition has built its survival upon. I am asking you to make room, within that doctrine, for a species that has something we may have quietly lost somewhere along the way. The willingness to believe that some lives are worth more than the numbers assigned to them. I watched 12 people prove that belief with everything they had. I do not think this coalition can afford to turn that conviction away. The chamber remained silent for a long moment after I finished speaking. I stood there, letting the silence stretch, unwilling to fill it with anything more, because I had said everything I came to say, and any further words would only weaken what already stood on its own. The Speaker of the Council rose slowly from her seat, her staff steady in her hand, her still-water eyes holding mine with a quiet intensity that told me my words had reached somewhere deep, whether or not they would be enough to change every mind in that room. "Thank you, Commander Vexthara Ilnor," she said. "Your testimony will be recorded and weighed alongside every report this council has received. The vote will proceed as scheduled." I stepped back from the center of the marble floor and took my place among the observers, my heart still heavy with the memory of Grace Miller's shaking hands, of Daniel Hart's quiet grief, of Ethan Cole admitting his fear without shame. I did not know how the vote would fall. I could not control the decisions of 40 different species, each carrying their own histories, their own doctrines, their own reasons for caution. But as I watched the delegates begin to murmur among themselves, as I saw the plated-skinned delegate lean toward the elder beside him with an expression I had not seen on his face when the session began, as I watched the young aide in the back row wipe quietly at her eyes, I allowed myself, for the first time since I had walked into that chamber, to feel something close to hope. Whatever came next, whatever the council decided in the hour ahead, I knew I had spoken the truth, exactly as I had lived it. I had told them about courage that did not deny fear, about a doctrine of caution that had nearly cost thousands of lives, about 12 people who gave everything they had for others who would never know their names. I had given them Grace Miller's story, and Daniel Hart's, and Ethan Cole's, carried carefully across 3 years and countless quiet nights when I could not stop thinking about the district cleared door by door, about the 19 minutes a shield generator held against odds that should have broken it. The tag rested warm against my chest as I waited for the vote, the way it always did, a small weight that had somehow become the heaviest and most important thing I carried. Whatever this council decided, I would carry that weight forward into whatever came next for this galaxy, because some truths, once spoken, could not be unspoken, and some debts, once understood, could never be repaid by silence. I had told them everything. Now it was their turn to decide what kind of coalition they wanted to be.